In the waning days of August 1814, I was informed of the arrest of a good friend of mine, Dr. William Beans, an elderly man of 65 years, a resident of Upper Marlboro, Maryland, some 16 miles southeast of Washington City. Just days before, the British had attacked the city of Washington, had burned much of it, including the President's mansion and the Capitol building. Within days, British soldiers and sailors were terrorizing the communities outside of Washington, including Upper Marlboro. Some of the soldiers entered that city threatening the townspeople, and the doctor was informed. Being a leading citizen of that town, he had those men arrested and placed in the town jail. Well, as luck would have it, one of those soldiers escaped and made his way back to his commander, Admiral Sir George Cockburn, the fleet being then located at Benedict, some miles to the south. This soldier informed Admiral Cockburn that he had been arrested, and Admiral Cockburn sent a detachment of troops back to Upper Marlboro to arrest Dr. Beans. He was placed in irons, forced to ride on a cadaverous horse 35 miles to that town of Benedict, where he was thrown in the hold of His Majesty's ship, the Tonnant. The news quickly spread in the area that Dr. William Beans had been arrested by the British Navy and Army. I was locking up my house one evening, my house in Georgetown, when there came a knocking at my door. I answered it, and I was soon informed that Dr. Beans had been arrested. I knew the old gentleman very well. He and I had worked together as fellow members of the Episcopal Church. He was a gentleman, he was a good man, and I knew that he was wrongfully detained. It seemed to me that it was my obligation as a Christian to seek his release from the British. And I was advised at the time that I should go to the President, President Madison, and ask the President for permission to negotiate for the release of Dr. Beans. It seemed to me, as a lawyer and as a well-known advocate in court, that I might render the doctor some good. And so I did go to see President Madison, and he agreed heartily that I should go on this mission. He was concerned that an American civilian had been arrested by British military officers. I remained concerned that my fellow Christian was in danger and in need, and I wanted to do all that I could to help him. The President advised me to go to Baltimore, there to meet with the American exchange agent, prisoner of war exchange agent, Mr. John Skinner. I went to Baltimore. And as I walked through the city streets, I was gratified to see men and women and children, black and white, free and slave, all joined together in one common effort to defend their homes and shops, their families, their very lives. Their courage, their determination bolstered my own as I sought to do good for my friend. I met Mr. Skinner in Baltimore, and together we sailed down the Chesapeake Bay to the British fleet, which was then located near the border of Maryland and Virginia. A letter had been sent to the commanders of the British Army and Navy in the meantime, to General Robert Ross, to Admiral Sir George Cockburn, to Admiral Alexander Cochrane, informing them of our soon arrival. Mr. Skinner and I met the British fleet on September the 7th. We boarded His Majesty's ship in Tournai. We were treated with every civility. A wonderful luncheon was spread on the table in the captain's cabin. Our conversation was convivial until we came to the purpose of our being there. Our purpose in having Dr. Beans released. At that moment, Admiral Coburn slammed his hand down on the table and insisted that Dr. Beans deserved no consideration whatsoever. I pleaded the old man's age, the fact that he was a civilian and should not have been taken prisoner by the Army and Navy. My arguments fell on deaf ears. But Mr. Skinner had with him a packet of letters written by British soldiers who had been who had been wounded at the Battle of Bladensburg, which occurred just a few days before the burning of Washington. In these letters, these British soldiers commended Dr. Beans, for he had treated their wounds. He saw to it that they were given food to eat and something to drink and a place upon which they might lie their heads and rest and become well again. These letters were given over to General Ross. He perused them, and despite the protest of the two admirals, decided to release Dr. Beans to the custody of Mr. Skinner and myself. We were granted permission to immediately visit the doctor in the hold of the ship, and when he saw us, he was overjoyed. But the joy of that meeting was tempered by our knowledge that the British now intended to attack the city of Baltimore. Baltimore at that time was the third largest city in the United States, and the British regarded it, because of its privateering vessels, which had done so much damage to the British merchant marine before and during the war. The British regarded Baltimore as a den of pirates. So we were informed that we were not to be released immediately, but must wait for the outcome of the attack on Baltimore. It was to be a two-pronged attack. There was to be a land attack at a place called North Point, about 10 miles east of the city. While that was occurring, the plan was that the British fleet would move ships up the Patapsco River to just outside Fort McHenry. With the land attack, American troops would be diverted. The fort and the city would be weakened. That was the British plan. The Battle of North Point occurred on September 12th. The British believed that the Americans there would run as they had run at Bladensburg. But the Americans at North Point held fast. They stood their ground. They attacked the British. General Ross, leading his troops on a white horse, was easily spotted and easily killed. And when he died, his troops lost heart. And within a very short period of time, they were making their way back to their transport ships on the river. The death of General Ross was communicated to the two admirals of the fleet, yet they continued to pursue their naval attack. Now, Mr. Skinner, Dr. Beans, and I had been transferred to the packet boat on which Mr. Skinner and I had sailed. Our boat was tethered to His Majesty's ship, the Surprise, and we were kept under guard. From that vantage point, we would witness the conflict that was to begin. 5 bomb ships and a rocket ship of the British Navy sailed up the Patapsco River to within 1.5 miles of the fort. The range of the British guns was about 2 miles. The range of the guns' forts, the fort's guns, was about 1.5 miles. The bombardment of Fort McHenry began in the early morning hours of September 13th. My companions and I watched from a distance of some 2 miles. The clouds hung low and dark that morning. Rain came and went and came again. Firing of rockets and bombs from the ships soon filled the air with smoke. And it was impossible for Mr. Skinner, Dr. Beans, and I to easily follow the course of the attack. Throughout the day, the bombs, the rockets never ceased being fired from the British ships. From time to time, British Navy would sail closer to the fort, and every time those ships moved closer, the guns of the fort opened fire and they retreated. And on it went throughout the day. As evening approached, my companions and I continued to wonder, continued to wait. I paced the deck of the packet boat, worrying for the fate of the fort, the men defending it, and the people of Baltimore. The only reassurance as night came on was the continuing firing of those British guns toward the fort. As long as those guns were firing, it seemed to me the fort had not surrendered. The people of Baltimore were still safe. And on it went into the early morning hours of September 14th. 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. Would the fort hold? Would Baltimore face destruction? Were the men at the fort able to defend her? Had the bombs reached the ramparts, the walls of the fort? How were the people of Baltimore experiencing this grand attack by the British Navy? The bombs continued to be fired. The rockets continued to cross the night sky. And then, at about 7 o'clock in the morning, the British guns ceased. No rockets crossed the sky. It was silent. My friends and I noticed the rocking of our boat by the waves. It remained silent. The sun was rising now in the sky. The clouds were parting. The smoke was dissipating. My friends suggested that I take up my telescope, that I look in the direction of the fort. I did so. First, I scanned the walls, the ramparts of that fort, and I could see that no damage had been done to them. And then I raised my glass higher, and as I looked through that glass, I saw the flag of my country waving over a city, the strength and pride of my native state, a city devoted to plunder and desolation by its assailants. I witnessed the preparation for its assaults. I saw the array of its enemies as they advanced to the attack. I heard the sound of battle. The noise of conflict fell upon my listening ear and told me that the brave and the free had met the invader. Then did I recall that there were gathered around that banner men who had heard and answered their country's call. And though I walked upon a deck surrounded by a hostile fleet, yet was my step firm and my heart strong. Through the clouds of war, the vision of that banner still shone in my view, and with that vision came an inspiration not to be resisted. Who say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? On the shore, dimly seen through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines in the stream. 'Tis the Star-Spangled Banner, oh long may it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country, would leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave, and the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Oh, thus be it ever, when free men shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace. May the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must, when our cause it is just. And this be our motto: in God is our trust. Thank you very much. I may have a moment or two for one or two questions. I understand that you have another speaker who is to follow me. So if there are any questions at this time, I would be happy to answer that one question or those two questions. Yes, sir.
You refer to God.
Yes, sir.
Very strongly.
Yes, sir.
How is that? Is there a national faith that believes that this country is protected by providence? Is that a common belief, or is that just poetic rhetoric?
I do believe that most people in the country, certainly at that time, believed that there was a divine providence overseeing all. And so I believe that the idea of an all-protecting providence met with the approval of most people in this country. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. One other question. Yes, sir.
Would you comment, Francis Scott Key was regarded pretty much as a racist during his time, and certainly today...
I beg your pardon, sir. I'm standing here before you. I have not gone away.
But by today's standard, he would be regarded as a racist because he thought that...
Well, I suppose I shouldn't have invited questions, should I?
a greater evil than slavery was the abolition of slavery.
Ah.
Okay, and in the
So-
third stanza, he references slavery in the hireling, and that became very controversial in his time, in modern times, on whether the Star-Spangled Banner was fitting because of his racial slants. Would you comment on that?
Well, I will comment to this extent, sir. You are quite right. I use those words, but hireling and slave.
Yeah.
But I would argue, sir, that my meaning was not the meaning that you suggest.
Well, I'm not suggesting...
No, sir. No, sir. No, let's not quibble, sir. Let's not quibble here, sir. You have accused me of something here, sir. And I am simply rebutting your accusal. Now, as my time is short, I must leave a fuller answer to another time. But I have been told that there is another speaker this evening who will address the very topic that you have brought forth. So I will thank you for that, and I will defer to his greater wisdom and understanding. Thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, hello, everyone. And again, it's a pleasure to be here with you. And I do want to thank you, sir, for asking that question. Mr. Key, of course, could not answer your question, but I will, right? So as many of you now know, I am from Baltimore. When it was announced in the news in late March that the Francis Scott Key Bridge had been struck and collapsed, like many of you perhaps, I was shocked. I have driven over that bridge many times over the past 45 years. What did not surprise me were the columns that appeared within a day in the Washington Post, the Washington Times, and an online African-American newspaper, The Root, editorializing that it was time to change the name of the bridge once it is rebuilt. Francis Scott Key was called a racist. He was called an enslaver. In his use of the phrase hireling and slave in the third verse of the Star-Spangled Banner, he was accused of advocating the murder of slaves. Annabelle Timken of the Washington Post made the claim that the Star-Spangled Banner did not become the national anthem for more than a century because of Key's racist views. What a lot of nonsense. The Star-Spangled Banner was already recognized as an unofficial anthem of the United States when Congress made the Star-Spangled Banner the official national anthem in 1931. Wayne Washington's column in the Root cited Key's prosecution of an abolitionist who in 1836 was charged with intending to distribute abolition pamphlets through the mail. At the time, it was against the law to distribute such pamphlets through the mail in Washington, D.C. As the district attorney of the District of Columbia, Key had to prosecute that case. Wayne Washington correctly noted that Key attempted to inflame the jury with these words: "Are you willing, gentlemen, to abandon your country, to permit it to be taken from you and occupied by the abolitionist, according to whose taste it is to associate and amalgamate with the Negro?" As the gentleman rightly pointed out earlier, that sounds awful to 21st century ears. But in 1836, most white people in this country could not imagine equality between the races. Abolitionism was a radical idea, a threat to social order and peace. Key opposed the continuation of slavery. I want to make that very clear. Key was opposed to the continuation of slavery in the United States. But like many others in his time, he thought that the advocates of immediate abolition hurt rather than helped the cause of ending slavery in the United States. In her article, Susan Ferrecchio of the Washington Times discussed the consideration of a Maryland school to drop Key's name. She quoted an 8th grade student who said, "It is important to learn about the wrongs he's done and why he shouldn't be honored." Both Miss Ferrecchio and the student are misinformed about Francis Scott Key's actions regarding slavery and race. After George Floyd's murder, the memorial in San Francisco was damaged. Later, 300 figures representing enslaved women were placed around the monument. Dana King, the sculptress, called Key a horrible person. She's wrong. So with this as background, let me pose and answer a question. Why does it matter whether or not the new bridge is named for Francis Scott Key? It matters because those who want his name dropped base their arguments on misinterpretations and misrepresentations of who he was and what he did regarding enslaved people and slavery. Such misrepresentations and misinterpretations have been used to slander Francis Scott Key. Misinterpretation of the 3rd verse of the Star-Spangled Banner has led the way in damning him. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. There you have it. The author of the Star-Spangled Banner hated slaves and wanted them dead. In 2017, this misinterpretation led to the desecration of the Key Memorial in Baltimore. It was spray painted with the words "racist anthem," and ink or paint was spilled into the fountain to represent blood. But such an interpretation that the Star-Spangled Banner is a racist anthem is wrong. The words hireling and slave did not imply to people then what they seem to imply to people now. The words hireling and slave were used before and during the American Revolution to express white Americans' fear of and contempt for anyone who was doing the bidding of the British Parliament and the British King, including the British Army and Navy. American revolutionaries believed that the British wanted to deny Americans their liberty and reduce them to a state of servitude. The Virginian Arthur Lee feared that the colonies would experience the fate of the Roman people in the deplorable times of their slavery. In Boston, in 1768, the town meeting minutes show us that Bostonians believed that judges controlled by the British Crown would complete our slavery. In Farmington, Connecticut, an assembly of citizens accused the British of a design to take away our liberties and properties and enslave us forever. In 1771, Benjamin Franklin wrote, "The more the people are dissatisfied, the more the British nation and government will become odious, and subjection to it will be deemed no longer tolerable. War ensues, and the bloody struggle will end in absolute slavery to America or ruin to Britain." The point is this: in the 18th century, the word slave did not always or even primarily refer to enslaved people of African descent. It was used to frame the argument that was raging between one group of Englishmen and another group of Englishmen, and they were all white. The generation that followed the founders, Francis Scott Key's generation, was raised on the fear of British designs to enslave Americans, white Americans. The words hireling and slave were used as epithets, words to disparage someone in the 18th and 19th centuries. They were meant to insult a free person who was carrying out the wishes of a more powerful person or entity. For a more recent example of the idea of an insult, think of the Chinese calling the South Vietnamese the running dogs or puppets of the Americans during the Vietnam War. It is the same idea, hireling and slave. You're working for the British. And they were talking about white people, not black people. In 1813, the year before Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, The Death of Warren, a poem, was published in a newspaper in Pennsylvania. It was a poem about the death of Dr. Joseph Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill. In it, Tyrant George assailed our shore, and thousands of his slaves sent o'er. General William Howe, who had the chief command of George's troops within our land, addressed thus his hireling band. Let's go back further into the 1600s. The word slave was used to mark a person of low birth. Think of Roman or Greek slaves as portrayed by William Shakespeare. In Hamlet, the title character mocked himself with these words, "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I." Those words, hireling and slave, were very familiar to Francis Scott Key and his contemporaries, and they had nothing to do with enslaved black people. Who then was Francis Scott Key referring to in the third verse of the Star-Spangled Banner when he used that phrase, hireling and slave? There are a few possible answers to this question. He might have been talking about the formerly enslaved black people who were recruited by the British Navy after the burning of Washington. This was the Corps of Colonial Marines. There were about 300 of them, but they amounted to about 6% of the 5,000 troops that were attacking Baltimore in 1814. If Key had them in mind, was he condemning them because of their race or because of their assistance to the British enemy? And it's worth noting again, Francis Scott Key was aware when he went through Baltimore on his mission to rescue Dr. Beans that there were free blacks and slaves helping to prepare the defenses of that city. And knowing this, it hardly seems likely that he would make it a point to attack people of African descent in a poem about the triumph of those same people and their white counterparts over the British foe. The point needs to be made. There is no solid historical basis for inferring that Francis Scott Key was singling out black people in verse 3 of the Star-Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key, in later writing about his interactions with the British while negotiating for Beans, said that the British officers were, quote, illiberal, ignorant, and vulgar, and seemed filled with a spirit of hatred against everything American. In the second and third verses of the Star-Spangled Banner, Key condemned the British in return. He called them haughty, a band whose foul footsteps were blood-soaked. In the third verse, he may well have been alluding to the fate of one of the British officers with whom he had dealt. Ironically, the one officer who was willing to be humane to Dr. William Beans. Mark Clegg, in his book, Oh Say Can You Hear, pointed out that the phrase hireling and slave is singular, not plural. General Ross was killed by an American sharpshooter the day before the bombardment of Fort McHenry. Accordingly, General Ross, a white man, maybe the hireling and slave who met the gloom of the grave in Key's third verse. Key was saying in that third verse that those who fought on behalf of Britain had a choice: either flee or die. Read the 4 verses of the Star-Spangled Banner. Key was telling the story of the noble nation, the valiant city attacked by a tyrant. It was the story of the Baltimore David defeating the British Goliath. Key was rhetorically thumping the chests of the people of Baltimore. He was thumping the American chest. There is nothing about race hatred in Key's words, unless it is hatred of the British race. Key was defiant, and he was voicing his disappointment with the British officers he had encountered. So aside from the Star-Spangled Banner, what else has damaged Francis Scott Key's reputation in recent years? Some people see racism in one of his responses to a questionnaire sent to him in 1839 by a well-known abolitionist, Benjamin Tappan. The Virginia legislature had coupled the emancipation of slaves with their deportation from the state. Key pointed out in answering Tappan's question that a majority of the Virginia legislature expressed the opinion that black people constituted a distinct and inferior race of people. But Key's explanation, his words, have been taken out of context so that he may be condemned. But Francis Scott Key was stating the opinion of the Virginia legislature, not his own. Key's answers to Tappan's questions are found in a pro-colonization publication, The American Repository, for April 1839. Now, colonization, if you're not familiar with it, was a concept for the removal of free blacks and freed slaves from the United States to the west coast of Africa to what is today Liberia. The American Colonization Society was founded in December of 1816 in Washington, and Key was one of the founders. Contemporary and modern critics of colonization say that it was intended to rid the United States of an unwanted black population. Supporters in its day and since have pointed out that it was impossible for black people to thrive and prosper in a white-dominated American society in the 1810s, 20s, and 30s. And isn't that part of the current cultural and social debate about race and racism in America today? That black people cannot thrive in this society. The same thing was being said 200 years ago. In answering Benjamin Tappan's questions, Key began by identifying himself as a Marylander, a resident of a slave state. But he said, "No northern man began the world with more enthusiasm against slavery than I did. For 40 years and upwards, I have felt the greatest desire to see Maryland become a free state. I feel sure that it will be so. I have always been endeavoring to aid in promoting that object, and do so still." He continued, "I believe that there is now a field open for the labors of all who wish to promote emancipation." He observed that no slave state adjacent to a free state can continue so. The people of Maryland are pleased at the prospect of becoming a free state. He urged that any slave who was to be freed should be trained in some trade or skill, agricultural or otherwise, to prosper in Africa. Like others, Key believed that those who were sent to Liberia would bring the light of Christianity to that continent. That's sincere, too. A lot of the colonizationists were raised in the Episcopal Church or the Methodist Church, were Quakers. They believed that black people, having been here, having been exposed to Christianity, would now export Christianity to Africa, and that was a good reason to colonize the formerly the former slaves were free blacks to Africa. To Tappan he confided, "I have emancipated 7 of my slaves. They've done pretty well, and 6 of them, now alive, are supporting themselves comfortably and creditably. Yet when age and infirmity come upon them, they will probably suffer." He was a slaveholder, he told Tappan, but he could not be otherwise without the greatest inhumanity. So again, that idea sounds really strange to us, but in his day, he was saying, in effect, that he had the ability, as a slave owner, to protect some of the slaves that he owned. I own, for instance, an old slave who has done no work for me for years. I pay his board and other expenses, and I cannot believe I sin in doing so. He continued, the laws of Maryland contain provisions of various kinds under which slaves in certain circumstances are entitled to petition the courts for their freedom. As a lawyer, I always undertook these cases with zeal and have been instrumental in liberating several large families and many individuals. Does this suggest to you that Francis Scott Key was a man who hated blacks, hated slaves, or liked slavery? I think not. How else can Francis Scott Key's reputation be rescued from those who are determined to condemn him? Let me begin with the Antelope case. In 1825, a case came before the United States Supreme Court involving the capture of a Spanish ship, the Antelope. Ship participated in the international slave trade and held about 150 Africans bound for slavery when it was captured by an American revenue cutter off the coast of Florida. The Supreme Court did not challenge the legality of the international slave trade, but it did deliver to the American Colonization Society 120 of the 150 Africans. They were returned to Africa, and this was done because Francis Scott Key was intimately involved in the case. He argued the case. He was part of the legal team that argued for freeing these black people. He said to the justices that according to some aspects of the law, the Africans were property, but by the law of nature, all men are free. Francis Scott Key was not a man who hated black people. He did not like slavery. Next, I invite you to consider Key's relationship with a man he freed, who continued to work for him, Clem Johnson. Uncle Clem and his wife Aunt Prissy were freed by Key in 1831. Just before a new Maryland law coupled emancipation with deportation, Clem Johnson continued to work for Francis Scott Key, and Key was obviously fond of him. He continued to be employed by Key as the manager of the household. And in a letter Key wrote to his wife, Polly, his affection for Clem Johnson is clear. Returning to his home in Frederick County, Maryland, Key said, I find it a most agreeable change to have no one to talk to but Uncle Clem and Aunt Prissy. Francis Scott Key could like and appreciate the company of this black couple. Their race was not a matter of concern. Finally, I give you a story that illustrates Francis Scott Key's respect for the prominent free black of Washington, D.C., William Costin. William Costin was a respected free black resident of Washington. When he died in June 1842, more than 70 carriages followed his casket to the cemetery. Behind the carriages was a long line of African American men on horseback. There was one white man on horseback, Francis Scott Key. This story was reported in an abolitionist newspaper, a paper opposed to the American Colonization Society. The editors of the Boston Emancipator knew Key was a colonizationist. And still, they praised Key as a distinguished white citizen of Washington, whose presence among a large number of colored men in doing honor to the memory of a deceased citizen of color evinces an elevation of soul highly honorable to Mr. Key and his profession, to Mr. Key as a friend of men of color. He rode alone. Francis Scott Key showed his respect for a black man. In preparing this talk, I shared it with a number of friends, one of whom is an African-American woman. And while her position on renaming the bridge is different from mine, she also expressed the idea that she didn't like the fact that Key's reputation was being sullied, and has been for years now. And she made the comment, and I agree with her, that more or less, Francis Scott Key was an ordinary man. But he did an extraordinary thing in 1814 when he wrote a poem that captured the sense of triumph and relief and honor that the country needed to express and celebrate at that time. Within 2 years, and for the rest of his life, he sought a solution to the problem of slavery in this country. Whatever the shortcomings of colonization, the fact remains that he labored to improve the lives of blacks in this country. It is also a fact that no one in Key's day could imagine a multiracial American democracy. That ideal belongs to a later time. It was only after the bloodshed of the Civil War that Key and his contemporaries wanted to avoid, and the social and political upheaval of Reconstruction, that the effort to create a colorblind American society was by some forcefully proposed and by others forcefully opposed in peacetime for a century. Is it right to judge and condemn Francis Scott Key by standards established after he was dead? He was not the enslaver, the Annabelle Timkins, the Wayne Washingtons, and others would make him out to be. He was not a horrible person, as San Francisco sculptress Dana King claims. Yes, we must always be open to re-evaluating our history. No nation's history is all glory and honor. There are dark places. Both the glories and the darknesses permeate the present. But we must know our history. We must be careful, very careful with it. We must not make assumptions because the words slave or slavery are associated with a historical figure. Francis Scott Key did not like slavery. He did not hate black people. He was not talking about enslaved African Americans in the third verse of the Star-Spangled Banner. He was not a white supremacist or a racist in the modern sense of those terms. There is a history behind those words, and what they imply now does not apply to Francis Scott Key. We do not serve the cause of a truthful history, a useful history when we employ half-truths and media-driven accusations to promote present-day political and social causes, or to protest injustice, whatever its source, whether from the left or the right. And Francis Scott Key does not deserve the dishonest portrayal and the meanness that has been dealt to him. It is my hope that when the new bridge is dedicated in the coming years, it will continue to bear the name of Francis Scott Key. He was a good man and still deserves the honor Baltimoreans and many, one hopes, most Americans have bestowed on him. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so are there any questions? And sir, did I answer your question? And if I was if Mr. Key was a bit rough on you, I will apologize for you.
That's all right. I asked you to comment on these controversies. I had no idea that you had done all your homework. So anyway, I'm glad I brought it up. And even Lincoln toyed with the
Colonization.
Colonization
He did.
Society. So
He did.
what could you say about it except the times have changed?
Right. Are there any other questions? Anything at all? Well, folks, I hope that you enjoyed that little talk. I really wanted to give this talk because I'm really concerned about how he's being treated and how the Star-Spangled Banner is being, I think, done wrong. So thank you very much. Thank you.